On a microscopic level, they exist to kill. They travel, they attack, they hide, they even gather together in defense maneuvers. Pathogens are the enemies of every member of the healthcare team. On Pathogens and PPE, we give you the tools you need to fight these threats and win. So sit back, tune in, and let's make these microbes tremble at the sound of your name.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Pathogens and PPE podcast. This is episode number 11, all about scopes, and I'm in the studio today with Arlene Bush. Welcome, Arlene. So happy to have you.
Hi, Jill. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Awesome. I'm happy to have you, and we have some great guests with us today. We have Jake McHugh, and we have Arlene Preston, and I am Jill Holdsworth. I'm the Manager of Infection Prevention at Emory University Hospital Midtown. And Arlene, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about you?
My name's Arlene Bush. I'm a supervisor at Lee County VA in Cape Coral, Florida, where it's a pleasure to serve veterans every single day.
Awesome. Well, don't go anywhere, guys. We will be right back. And this is an amazing episode, so you don't want to miss anything. Welcome back, everybody, to the Pathogens and PPE podcast. My name is Jill Holdsworth, and I'm here with my co-host, Arlene. And we are here to talk all about scopes. And we are joined here in the studio today with Jake McHugh and Arlene Preston. Jake, why don't you give us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jake McHugh. I'm a process improvement auditor at Agility. I've been in sterile processing industry for about 15 years.
Awesome. Welcome back to the studio, Jake. 2 episodes in a row. That's awesome. Arlene Preston, welcome to the show. Let us know a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thanks for having me. My name's Arlene Preston. I'm a senior coordinator for infection prevention out of Atlanta, Florida through Emory. I have been doing infection prevention for a little over 8 years with a nursing background that spans about 15 years. And currently here I have focuses with endoscopy, high-level disinfection, and as well as environmental controls.
Awesome. Happy to have you, Arlene. Of course, I work with Arlene here at Emory, so excited to have Arlene on with us today. All right, so we are going to dive right into talking all about scopes, and we really want to touch on how we can partner with our sterile processing technicians and infection prevention. So let's get the conversation started. And Arlene, I'll talk to you first. How have you seen this successful in your practice when talking about scopes going to sterile processing or even going to the endoscopy area? How have you seen it to be successful when you partner with your infection preventionist?
I think the first thing I like to say is that it's about presence, especially for the IP. I know sometimes, depending on your background, you may not be familiar with the sterile processing path flow area. You see red lines, it might kind of scare you. You read about this in books, but really it's a great opportunity for them to teach you what they are masters and skills at, and then bring that IP body of knowledge about how bacteria transmits, best practices, and then kind of start networking with those teams on how to push good practices through and validate the practices they currently have going on. And it all starts with just showing up and saying hi.
I loved it whenever I partnered with my infection preventionist. I would give them tours around the department, and they would catch occasionally things that, we had just become blind to because we saw it every day, or they'd raise awareness that maybe one person is kind of out of alignment with everybody else. So I always appreciated those guys up there.
You're kind of hit on something Jake calls normalized deviation, right? Like you're in the space all the time and things tend to drift. Like we have compliance drift. There's been a lot of literature about that, and you normalize it. And then you have somebody who isn't in the space and they come in and they're kind of pointing out something, and then you're like, oh my, I totally didn't see that or didn't know that. And so that's great examples of partnership to kind of notice those things and get things back on track.
100%.
I always welcome our infection preventionists to our department. It's always wonderful to have that type of co-leadership, and multiple eyes on our processes is always welcomed and often better. We're better as a whole, right? So partnering with our IP professionals, because when there's a finding, it's going to be an IP hit, right? In sterile processing, if you're being surveyed, it's going to fall under IP. So we want those collaborations with infection preventionists in our departments so we can kind of foresee any kind of citing or non-compliance in the other areas. Or we can also partnership outside of SPD, right? So it's pivotal to have that working relationship with your infection preventionist.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jake, I want to kind of throw this one to you. What do you feel like the biggest challenges are in regards to infection prevention when it comes to reprocessing scopes?
Ooh, that's a big one, because flexible endoscopes can be challenging for some departments. They really need education on the whole process end to end. But if I really had to put my finger on one of the bigger challenges, it was hand hygiene. So whether that is changing gloves on a regular basis between the different parts of that process, or just regular washing of hands. You just got done cleaning the scope, you're taking all your PPE off, you're trying to get to the next section to move on. Your mind is usually in a go, go, go mentality, when it's like, wait, nope, I have to use hand sanitizer, I have to wash my hands, some part of that process to be safe moving forward. Along the same lines, especially if you're using an AER automated endoscope reprocessor, is you're handling that manually cleaned but still technically contaminated scope, putting it into the basin, and then people usually go and start touching keypads and using mice, and it's like, no, you have to change gloves before you close that unit. And even if you change gloves and perfect hand hygiene, you really should wipe things down after you're done. Probably the hardest part that I see people comply with, because their mind is in another place, and I can totally appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that's great comments, Jake. I know depending on, some reprocessing is a 1-room setup, some is a 2-room setup, and it can be very easy to put PPE on the decon side, and then you're just carrying that over all the way, that same PPE, that same gloves. I've seen it sometimes where they carry it all the way over through the HLD side and even onto the drying side, and it's the same gowns, it's the same gloves, and you just spent all this time, right, meticulously brushing and flushing and spending like up to an hour or more, and then you're just recontaminating it at the end of all your work. And so especially if you only have like a 1-room setup, that can be challenging, and you kind of need somebody to point out. And one thing we did is try to define, okay, what is decon? Like when we say the decon, the cleaning side, what is that? Where does that stop? Do I have PPE readily available there? Do I have hand hygiene there? Because again, if you are taking off gloves, you should be washing your hands, right? And then putting stuff back on, and then continuing on with the process. And then when you stop there, now you're going into your drying storage side, taking stuff off, putting it on, right? And so do you have a setup that is conducive? Do you have materials that are readily available? Because if I have to walk all the way back over to the decon side to get more PPE from the drying side, that is a bad one-way process, because I'm having to go back and forth, right? And so this is where I think the IP and sterile processing, you know your flow. IP knows good practices for cross-contamination. How can we partner and make sure you have all the tools in the right spaces you need it at the right part of the process that it's needed in? So it's a great comment.
Yeah, it's really important to have all of the items that you need in the places they need to be used at. Because if you don't have it in the place it needs to be used, it won't be used, right? So make it easy for them. If you put it in the area it's required in.
And Erin, you mentioned having PPE where you needed it, but what about hand hygiene? I see a lot of departments not really set up to follow what we would expect as IPs for hand hygiene compliance. But again, we have to make it as easy as possible. If we want people to take their gloves off and immediately use hand hygiene, then we need to spend some time there and see where they're taking their gloves off, right? I mean, it seems like that's a pretty simple thing. So what have you seen as far as how successful we have been in making it easy for our team members to be successful as far as workflow? Do we still have some work to do? And what do you suggest for those that are listening as far as how to do that?
Yeah, I think that it's a constant improvement process, because even once you get like your dream set up, so let's take, we just had the opportunity to build a brand new building and design our own endoscopy reprocessing room from scratch, right? But then all of a sudden things changed. Like originally we were only going to do so many scopes from a couple areas. Then all of a sudden is we are doing now scopes for the entire facility. So things change. You have new scopes bring in. Like originally it was supposed to be interventional pulmonary, and now all of a sudden they're like, well, we're going to let GI do it, and we're going to start doing linear EUS, and now you have more coming, and so that means more storage. So storage has to shift around a little bit, and so you're constantly going back and forth with the team to say, okay, how is this going to affect? Just like if you have new materials that get brought in, the first thing you say is, okay, well, everyone needs to get competency on the new materials. But at the same time, great time for the IP to also partner with you to say, okay, how is this affecting your flow? What do we need to add, change, make a counteraction for? Because if this goes here, now the PPE has to shift over. Now the PPE is not near where our hand hygiene is supposed to be. And so if I have to walk that much further, my chance I'm going to do hand hygiene is about to go down. In the patient room, in our patient's room, they talk about the patient care zone and having hand hygiene really close to that where the work is actually taking place. SPD is the same exact thing. You want to have the hand hygiene close to where the PPE is and close to where the work's being done. Otherwise, if you have to walk 8 steps, your compliance is going to drop, and that's not going to be good for patient safety.
It's absolutely true. I couldn't agree more. It is important where it is located, and we need to make the process simple and accessible.
Jake, I want to go back to what you talked about regarding wiping things down, because I don't see this emphasized quite enough. And I think it's such a great point. And I want you to go into a little bit more detail about how often should we be wiping our sinks down? How often should we be wiping down those countertops where we put the manually cleaned instrument down? Because I don't think that the standard work around this is defined well enough, but I really want to emphasize it here for all of those listening, because this is really important to me and to all IPs out there, and I want to make it really important to everybody working in sterile processing.
Oh, Jill, you're going to get me in trouble, aren't you?
These are just the opinions of all of us on this call. We're just making recommendations.
Okay, no worries. But so, every time you clean a flexible scope in the sink, your sink should get wiped down between every single scope. You can't clean a new scope in a dirty sink. We want to reduce that cross-contamination. Now, anytime that even a manually cleaned scope goes onto a work surface, you just took it out of the sink, you're putting it to the side so you can change your PPE, that area should get wiped down every single time it gets exchanged. I have seen some places where they use disposable liners to kind of cover the work surface. Now, you may not need to wipe the surface underneath every single time, but you should exchange those liners, and you should be wiping down your work surfaces, whether that's between shifts or at end of day, start of day. You just really want to make sure everything is getting cleaned as much as possible. When you're going into those AER endoscope reprocessor rooms, you want to wipe those down every single time, because you could be transferring things, even if it's just coming with you from the transfer between rooms. Our air particles follow us wherever we go, and they're going to land wherever they want to land, and we can't see them.
Jake, I'm so glad that you mentioned the disposable liner. I had no idea people were using that, but I'm going to ask Aaron to explain my analogy that I'm going to make for me. I'm laughing because I think he knows what I'm going to ask. Aaron, can you explain in the world of transvaginal probes why we don't allow the disposable liner to take the place of cleaning?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think everyone thinks that they put that sterile cover over this and somehow magically nothing will ever go around it, have any cross-contamination risk while removing it. And therefore, we can completely skip the cleaning part, right? And so, but in the end, we know, and I think the FDA's made it quite clear, just for all the naysayers out there, that even if you use a probe cover, you have to still run that through cleaning, even high-level disinfection, because it doesn't take the place of replacing that process. And to kind of tag in with what Jake was saying about the liners on the countertops, we ourselves also use liners such as that. And then, so my question back to them is, when do you replace it? Like, do you replace it after each scope? Do you replace it like once an hour? Do you replace it when it's visually dirty? Or does it stay there in perpetuity until terminal cleaning is done, the next day, if then, right? And so I think that's a good part to start having conversations about what is your process, because otherwise, again, going back to the PPE question before, you spend all this time doing wonderful work following this very meticulous process, and you're just recontaminating it in the end with stuff that was left behind before. And so it's a question to raise. And I think there's answers out there, but it's a collaborative effort on reaching that answer based on the room setup and the materials that you're using.
Yeah, I've had questions lately, too, about probe covers, not just vaginal probe covers, but other probe covers. And the end users have asked, does it still need to be, reprocessed because it has a probe cover? That doesn't mean that probe cover is not going to be intact all the time. A hole could be found later after the examination. So we always treat it like there isn't a probe cover and that it should be reprocessed between every patient. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Aaron. It's a huge part kind of when some end users don't understand what SPD has to do when it comes to probe covers and non-critical items. But I mean, if the probe cover breaks, right, it becomes critical, doesn't it?
Jake and I were just having this conversation this past week, I believe, about gloves. And it really begs the need for, why do I have to wash my hands if I wear gloves? And gloves are not a catch-all, like it saves me from everything. Nothing can touch me if I wear gloves, but gloves can always have tiny pinholes, tiny tears. Gloves are not 100% all of the time. And yes, gloves can protect you from a lot of things, but you do also have to wash your hands prior to putting gloves on, because if you touch your gloves with dirty hands and then you put your gloves on and then you contaminate the outside of the gloves, now you're contaminating everything else you touch. When you take your gloves off, you have to doff gloves correctly, and we need to make sure we're doing that without contaminating ourselves. Then we have to wash our hands after we take our gloves off. We might have had a tiny hole or a tiny tear in the gloves we didn't know about. We might have contaminated ourselves when we took those gloves off. Washing your hands when you take your gloves off is so important. And it's the same concept as we just talked about with these probe covers. We have to make sure that we are cleaning our hands, cleaning those probes, cleaning things, even though we have a cover of sorts on our hands, on our probes. So really the same kind of concept there. And I wanted to ask Jake kind of a follow-up question, if you don't mind covering this, but what about the things that we transport scopes in? Do they need cleaned the same way?
Absolutely. That's a great point. So any transportation devices, whether that is, a case cart system or plastic bins that are specially made for transporting scopes, you have to clean those in between every use. Now, hopefully you can find something that can go through an automated washer, like a cart washer, so long as the IFU says that it can go through. But even those manually cleaned bins, transport bins or transport devices, finding out what does the instructions for use dictate on how to clean them. That's very important. And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier about cleaning surfaces, making sure that the wipes you're using are appropriate for what you're cleaning. I have seen plenty of areas where they're using bleach wipes and it's just, stripping the paint off the walls or the laminate off the counter if they have that. Some automated endoscope reprocessors have specific notes on what you can surface wipe down the outside because you don't want the numbers on the buttons to come off if you're using too harsh a chemical. So IFUs for the devices you're cleaning and what you're cleaning it with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Definitely result back to the IFU when it comes to cleaning efficacy and products you can use on equipment, right? Because if you're not using the validated cleaning solutions, then are you really cleaning it?
This is another great reason you should partner with your IP anytime you get a new piece of equipment in to your facility or you're thinking about bringing in something new to your facility, whether it's equipment, whether it's a new piece of instrumentation, a new scope. It's better to bring IP in prior to purchasing something rather than having the issues later and IP saying you have to follow these IFUs and it's going to be almost impossible to do so. Let's all work together and let's make sure we have the right disinfectants, to your point, Jake, because a lot of times these companies, they have very specific brands that they've tested and verified, and it becomes a pain to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And so we have to work really hard to make sure that we're doing the right thing, or we do our own validations or our own risk assessment. So just talking about that, Aaron, what kind of advice do you have for folks in the OR and sterile processing just about that? I know we've gone through this a lot over the last 5 years that we've worked together. So how do you suggest that folks go through risk assessments in their facility involving IP and the end users prior to purchasing new items?
Yeah, that's really good. I think in the end, it starts with communication and ends with communication. I'm sure Jake will probably agree that it's really annoying when a provider wants to do a new procedure or use new equipment and nobody involves IP, nobody involves SPD. And all of a sudden they're like, look, we don't have the setup to actually clean this. Or it's an extremely laborious process to run it through because they can't go in the STARAD or, so now we have to develop this whole workaround and you're saying the first case is tomorrow. Well, right. It puts everyone in an uncomfortable situation. And so it starts with saying, hey, I want to try something new. Great. At the same time, they are trialing because very few times does somebody bring in something cold turkey without ever even trying it in the space. Right. At the same time they're trying it, we should be trying it to see how it's going to get reprocessed, what chemicals are needed, how is this going to fit in? Do we have everything? Does it really fit into our already existing chemical inventory, or is this going to be something in addition? Because who wants to add one more thing? Obviously, if the choice is between two items, the thing that already fits into your inventory and your chemical process is probably going to be something that's a lot easier to manage, which means it's going to be more readily available. And so I think that's some of the feedback to our OR groups is that communication early on any change.
Aaron, do you guys have an equipment committee that you would talk about prior to purchasing equipment to make sure we have the correct cleaner that's needed in the facility before
in an ideal
the equipment
state,
gets there?
Yes. I think we are all striving for that ideal state. I think it's out there. It's good for the listeners to know that that should be something to strive for because it's going to avoid headaches later on, both for in your sterile processing department and for your infection prevention, because then nobody has to be the bad guy to say what needs to be done or how that's going to cost or how much it's going to delay turnaround. Because you can have that conversation up front, and that should go into the decision-making process, and if that should even be brought in the first place.
And we usually end up being the bad guys, the IPs, so we appreciate not having to be the bad guys.
We love having IP on our committees, and it is important for everybody to have a seat at the table when we talk about new assets or equipment that are going to be used in our facilities, right? This happened to me this week where I had a one-off item was used at a sister facility, not supposed to be used at my facility, somehow showed up here and nobody can clean it.
That is definitely...
Who brought it here?
That is definitely a magic word that is showing up in more and more regulations and standards as a multidisciplinary committee.
That's a big phrase, isn't it? It's kind of scary when you hear about it.
You have to be involved in something.
All right, guys, we are actually nearing the end of our time, but I do have one more question as a follow-up to the last episode 10 on high-level disinfectants and sterilants, which Jake was actually one of our guests on that too, and I didn't have time to ask him this question, so I want to make sure I get it in on this one. But Jake, you talked about how we should start looking at our scopes and start to understand which ones could go from high-level disinfection to sterilization. And I found that really interesting, and just kind of wrapping my head around how could we start doing that? And what does the process look like? Even if you didn't immediately start going to sterilizing some of these scopes, what would you recommend as like a first step for facilities if they were wanting to start this process of just saying, I wonder which ones I have that actually say in the IFUs could be sterilized, or maybe I could improve the way that we're currently doing it from now to a different process. What's your advice for people listening on how they can just get started with that process, even if they're not ready quite yet to go to sterilizing?
Well, that is an excellent question. And what I would do is I would start to gather a list of all the items that you currently high-level disinfect. So getting those catalog numbers, reference numbers, whatever you will call them, and then start to review their instructions for use. So seeing if it can go through a sterilization process, because there are some items that can't. And you might find out that even if it can, you may not have that device, that reprocessor unit to sterilize. So after you kind of gather all that information, the next part is really getting that multidisciplinary committee together. So you can have other people backing you up. You can have other people helping form that plan, or at least that message to say, hey, there are a lot of things out there that we're high-level disinfecting, and we really need to move them over to sterilization. Here's why, and here's how to do it. After you kind of get that process going, actually, let me take a step back, because not only do we have to sterilize those devices correctly, we have to make sure that we have containers to put those devices in. And we have to make sure, if the devices already have containers, that those containers can be sterilized in an appropriate way that we may or may not have. So gather that information too. And then educate the staff on what you're doing. You know, not only the end users, because there could be a change in their process. It might take a little longer. It might be going to a different area. Educate the staff who are going to be reprocessing, because, you know, we're going to get an inflow of the different devices coming through. They need to know about that. Plan out if there will be problems, because a few things can go on. You're going to have possibly a bottleneck because more volume is coming through. And you may or may not have the devices. If you have low temp sterilizers, if you have high temp sterilizers, do you have enough? Do you have enough biologicals to run these through? RAP indicators, because of the change in process. And then I always mention, when you are moving from a high-level disinfection to a sterilization process, be prepared that some of those items are going to go out for repair afterwards. You're changing to a harsher process, and couldn't tell you what it is outside of that. The molecules in the devices just get so used to certain, chemicals, certain cleaning methods. Once it goes into that sterilizer, it just seems to not like it and immediately goes out for repair. So those are all very important parts to look out for.
That was great advice. Thanks so much for that. Jake, I think that everybody can take that away and say, here's some steps that we can do right now to help do this process, take some initial steps just to see what we have in our facilities and what we can do to take some initial fact-finding steps and see if we even have any scopes to start sterilizing, see if we have the right equipment. I think the container comment was a great one. Do we even have containers? Even if we wanted to start this, do we even have containers to do this? So that was some great advice. I'm glad I got that question in right at the end of this episode. With that, we are out of time. This was a great conversation. Thank you guys for being here, Jake and Erin, and thank you to my amazing co-host, Arlene.
Thank you.
And with that, we will close out episode 11, and we will see you next time. Thanks, guys.
One of the key points that Jake and Erin spoke about was the importance of transportation bins and how items are transported. I can't stress that enough, that we all need to have transportation and how items will be transported as key talks if we're going to change processes. I think that's something that's commonly forgot about. So I appreciate Jake and Erin bringing it up today in our show.
Some of the things I loved hearing, of course, as an IP, was talking about gloves, hand hygiene, and wiping things down. Of course, hand hygiene is always going to be paramount in everything that we do as IP. So we love to hear about making standard work easy. And if we want people to use hand hygiene when they take off their gloves, then let's make it easy. Let's make sure that there's a hand hygiene dispenser where they take off their gloves. Let's make sure that we are setting people up for success in these areas. So as IPs and as leaders in the departments, we need to make sure we're spending the time down there watching the workflows and making sure that we have the tools and the equipment and everything necessary to be successful. And I loved how Jake talked about things that needed wiped down. The sink every time, work surfaces where things that were manually cleaned were being handled. We need to really be thinking about all of the surfaces that are being potentially contaminated and ensuring that the disinfectant wipes are nearby. Are they easily accessible? Because if they're not, guarantee you they're not going to be used. So much great content in this episode. I loved having our guest on to talk. I loved my co-host Arlene on this one. So this was such a great episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to wash your hands and keep fighting dirty.
Thanks for tuning in to this exclusive podcast series on pathogens and PPE. For more information and clinical resources to help you fight dirty, make sure to follow us on social media by searching for Beyond Clean and Transmission Control.